In the spring of 1894, in a boarding house on the edge of Buffalo, New York, a woman named Adelaide Voss woke up in the middle of the night because she heard breathing on the other side of her bedroom wall. Not scratching, not rustling, not the sound of mice in the plaster. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, human breathing, less than a foot away from her ear. She told the landlord the next morning. The landlord laughed. He said, "The walls in an old house talk to you if you listen too hard." He told her to have a whiskey before bed and stop reading ghost stories in the paper. 2 weeks later, Adelaide Voss was dead. So was the maid on the 3rd floor. So was a travelling salesman from Rochester who had checked in for a single night and never checked out. And when the Buffalo police finally tore open the walls of that house on the morning of the 19th of May, 1894, what they found inside the plaster wasn't a rat's nest, or a raccoon, or a burglar hiding from the law. It was a family, a mother, a father, and 2 grown children, living in the walls, watching. For 9 years. They had names, they had a history, they had a reason, and by the time the story of the Crandall family made it into the papers, someone very powerful decided you were never supposed to hear about them again. This is the deranged, and almost entirely buried, story of the Crandalls of Buffalo, New York. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you in the comments. If you had been Adelaide Voss that first night, listening to breathing on the other side of your bedroom wall, what would you have done? Would you have told anyone? Would you have moved out the next morning? Or would you have convinced yourself, the way she did, that old houses just make old sounds? Drop a one-word answer in the comments. Stay, run, or listen. I read every reply on the first night this video goes live, and I want to know how many of you would have survived what happened at Worthing House. Now, back to the story. Worthing House sat on Delaware Avenue in Buffalo, 3 miles from the Erie Canal, in a stretch of the city that in 1894 was neither wealthy nor poor. It was a place for people passing through, grain merchants coming in for the wheat auctions, railroad clerks on layover, widows on modest pensions, domestic servants between jobs. It was the kind of address you gave when you didn't want anyone to remember you had been there. The house itself had been built in 1871 by a man named Elias Worthing, a lumber baron who wanted a city residence for entertaining. It had 4 floors above ground, a cellar that ran the full footprint of the building, and a strange, disproportionate attic space that the original architect, a Prussian named Crellman, had insisted on. Crellman's blueprints, which survived in the Buffalo City records until at least 1937, showed something unusual about the walls of Worthing House. The interior walls were nearly 3 times as thick as they needed to be. Not the exterior walls, the interior walls, the ones between the bedrooms, the ones separating the parlour from the dining room, the ones running up alongside the servants' stairs. Elias Worthing died in 1883. His widow, who never liked the house, sold it within 18 months to a man named Harold Beckwith, who converted it into a boarding establishment. Beckwith did no structural changes. He didn't need to. The house was already, whether he understood it or not, built for people to live inside its walls. Beckwith was the landlord Adelaide Voss complained to on the morning of the 3rd of April 1894. He was the man who told her the walls in an old house talk to you. He was also, as investigators would eventually determine, the man who had knowingly rented rooms in a house he had every reason to know was compromised. But we'll get to that. For 9 years before Adelaide Voss checked into room 2C, Worthing House operated the way any boarding house operated. Tenants came, tenants went. Some stayed for months, some stayed for a night. And a small but statistically strange number of them, roughly 1 every 14 months, simply disappeared. No forwarding address, no note. Sometimes their belongings were still in the room. Sometimes the bed was still warm. Beckwith kept a ledger. The Buffalo Historical Society still has partial photographs of it. 7 names over 9 years, with the word "departed" written next to each one in Beckwith's careful slanted handwriting. Departed. As if they had simply chosen, one after another, to walk out of his house without paying, without packing, and without ever being seen again. The Buffalo police, before 1894, had no reason to connect these disappearances. Boarding house tenants ran off all the time. They skipped rent. They fled bad marriages. They joined the circus. They went west. They took new names. The city was full of people who were nobody in particular. Their leaving was not a mystery, it was just the way the country worked in that decade. But somebody was noticing. Somebody, inside those thick, disproportionate interior walls, was keeping their own ledger, and somebody was deciding which tenants got to depart and which tenants got to disappear. To understand what was found in the walls of Worthing House on the morning of the 19th of May 1894, you have to understand who the Crandall family was before they went inside those walls, because they were not always people who lived in plaster. Once they were a respectable family in western New York, and their fall from that respectability is the entire reason this story exists. Silas Crandall was born in 1,841 inches, Cattaraugus County, about 80 miles south of Buffalo. He was, by every account that survives, an ordinary man. He farmed. He married a local schoolteacher named Marguerite Halloway in 1866. They had 2 children, Ambrose, born in 1868, Cordelia, born in 1871. The Crandalls attended a Methodist church, paid their taxes, and were remembered by neighbours, decades later, as a family who kept to themselves but never gave any offence. Marguerite, according to a distant cousin who was interviewed by a Buffalo newspaper in 1912, was the sharper one. She had ambitions. She wanted her children to go to school in Buffalo. She wanted Silas to give up the farm and take a clerking position in the city. Silas resisted. Marguerite pushed. And in 1881, the family sold the farm, moved to Buffalo, and Silas took a position as a bookkeeper for a shipping concern on the waterfront. For 4 years, the Crandalls lived in a townhouse on Ellicott Street. Ambrose, who was then in his mid-teens, apprenticed with a printer. Cordelia attended a girls' academy. Marguerite kept the house. Silas balanced ledgers. It was, on paper, exactly the life Marguerite had wanted. And then in the winter of 1884, something happened. What exactly happened is one of the parts of this story that got buried, and I want to be careful here, because the primary source we have for it is a single police interview conducted in 1894 with a man named Hiram Booth, who had been a foreman at the shipping concern where Silas Crandall worked. Booth's testimony was reprinted in one Buffalo newspaper, the Evening News, and then in no other. Every other paper that covered the Crandall case either omitted Booth's account or contradicted it, which is, by itself, a signal that his account was closer to the truth than anyone in the city wanted to admit. According to Booth, Silas Crandall was accused, in the winter of 1884, of embezzling company funds. The amount was not large, roughly $900, which in 1884 was maybe half a year's wages for a bookkeeper. Silas denied the accusation. The company did not press charges, but Silas was quietly dismissed, and the reason for his dismissal was communicated, in the small and gossipy world of Buffalo commerce, to every other shipping concern and counting house in the city. Silas Crandall could not get another position, not as a bookkeeper, not as a clerk, not as anything. By the spring of 1885, the Crandalls were behind on rent. By the summer, they had sold most of the furniture. By the autumn, Marguerite was pawning her jewellery. And in November of 1885, the Crandall family was evicted from their townhouse on Ellicott Street. They had nowhere to go. They had no money. They had no family in the city willing to take them in, because Marguerite's ambition had cut them off from Silas's people down in Cattaraugus, and Marguerite's own family had all died young. What happened to them between November of 1885 and the following spring is the part that no source can confirm. Booth said they lived on the streets. Another witness said they slept in a Methodist mission on Genesee Street. A third witness, a woman who ran a lodging house nearby, said she saw all 4 of them, gaunt and dressed in the same clothes they had been evicted in, walking north on Delaware Avenue in a snowstorm sometime around Christmas of 1885, and then, sometime in the winter or early spring of 1886, the Crandall family disappeared from every public record in the state of New York. No death certificates, no burials, no arrests, no admissions to any workhouse, poorhouse, or asylum. They were simply gone. They were gone from the world for the next 9 years, but they were not gone from Buffalo, and they were not gone from Worthing House. Here is the question that anyone hearing this story asks, and it is the right question to ask. How does a family of 4 get inside the walls of a boarding house without the landlord knowing? And how do they stay there for 9 years? The answer, when you piece together what the Buffalo police eventually documented and what Booth and other witnesses testified to, is both simpler and more disturbing than you would expect. Worthing House had a cellar, and the cellar, because of the way Crellman had designed the building in 1871, had 2 access points that Beckwith, the landlord, either did not know about or chose to pretend he did not know about. The main cellar door was inside the pantry, behind the kitchen, and it required a key that Beckwith kept on his belt. The secondary access, which is the one that matters, was in the exterior wall behind a coal chute on the north side of the building. The coal chute door was, in 1886, almost never used. Worthing House had converted to gas heating in 1884, and the coal delivery entrance had been sealed and forgotten. Sealed, but not welded shut. It was still, if you were desperate enough, and small enough, an entry point. The Crandalls, when they were finally discovered, were all, by then, malnourished to the point of being small enough. Cordelia weighed, according to the coroner's estimate, less than 70 pounds at the time of her arrest. Ambrose weighed less than 100. Marguerite and Silas were, by any modern medical standard, in the last stages of chronic starvation. They had been eating just enough, for 9 years, to remain alive. The current best reconstruction of how they got in, based on the police report, is this. Sometime in the winter of 1885, or the spring of 1886, Silas Crandall pried open the coal chute. The family climbed inside. They dropped into the cellar, and in that cellar, in the northeast corner, they found something that Crellman had built into the house in 1871 and that no one, in the 15 years since, had ever documented. They found an interior stairway, a narrow, hidden wooden stairway inside the walls that ran from the cellar, up between the ground floor rooms, up between the second floor rooms, up between the third floor rooms, and terminated in the attic. It had ventilation slats at every level. It had small horizontal viewing gaps at the height of a standing man's eye. It had, at 3 separate points, tiny wooden hatches that opened directly into the guest rooms of Worthing House. Crellman, in 1871, had built Elias Worthing a house with a hidden interior passage. Why he did it, whether Worthing had asked for it, whether it was intended as a servant's passage, a smuggler's route, or something more sinister, was never established. Crellman was dead by 1886, and Worthing was dead by 1883, and the passage had, apparently, been forgotten by everyone who had ever known about it. Everyone except a starving family who climbed in through the coal chute and found it. Before we move on to what happened next, stop for a second. What you just heard about the hidden interior stairway inside the walls of Worthing House is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full account. The Crellman blueprint, the coal chute entry, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. For the first weeks, they must have simply been sheltering. They had walls. They had a roof. They had a hidden space that no one in the boarding house above them knew existed. What they did not have was food, water, or any way to earn any of it. They began, at first, small. According to the police report, the earliest signs of the Crandalls' presence in the house, which several tenants reported to Beckwith in 1886 and 1887, were minor thefts. Bread from the kitchen, a pitcher of water left on a hallway table, a shawl from a hook, nothing that could not be blamed on a forgetful boarder or a light-fingered maid. Then, in October of 1887, a boarder named Josiah Wren, a widowed clockmaker who had lived in room 3A for 4 months, was found dead in his bed. The coroner ruled it heart failure. He was 58, overweight, and a heavy drinker. Nothing about his death alarmed anyone, except that a small brass key, which he had worn on a chain around his neck and which opened his personal strongbox, was missing. Wren's strongbox, when it was finally opened by a locksmith, was empty. Wren had been known to keep at least $400 in it. The money was never accounted for. Beckwith blamed the maid, dismissed her, and moved on. But somewhere in the walls, a family that had not eaten a full meal in 2 years suddenly had money, and a family that had just learned that a man could die quietly in his bed in this house without anyone asking too many questions. That was the beginning, and once it began, it did not stop for 7 more years. From the winter of 1887 through the winter of 1893, the Crandall family lived inside the walls of Worthing House. 6 full years. 6 winters where the interior of that hidden stairway must have been below freezing. 6 summers where the space between the walls must have baked in the July heat until the air was almost unbreathable. 6 years of eating scraps taken from the kitchen. 6 years of drinking water siphoned from wash basins after the tenants had gone to sleep. 6 years of never, as far as any surviving evidence suggests, speaking above a whisper. And they were not alone in there, all 4 of them. The mother, the father, the son, and the daughter, ages that ranged by 1893 from the early 20s to the early 50s. 6 years of that. This is the part of the story that, when I first started reading the source material, I could not process. It's the part that makes people, when they hear it, ask the question that Buffalo asked in 1894 and that no one has ever really answered. Why? Why not leave? Why not simply, one night, open the coal chute, walk out, and go to a mission, a church, a workhouse, anywhere? The answer that the police investigators arrived at, and that Booth agreed with in his interview, was that by 1887 the Crandalls could not have left, not physically, not psychologically. Something had happened to them in the walls that had made the walls, by then, the only place they could survive. Silas, according to the notes taken by the arresting officers, had lost most of his hearing in his left ear from an infection that went untreated in 1888. Marguerite had gone almost entirely blind in her right eye. Ambrose, when he was arrested, had a spine so curved from years of crouching that he could not stand fully upright. Cordelia, who had been 13 when the family entered the walls, had grown to adulthood inside them. She had never, since the age of 13, walked more than the distance of the hidden stairway. She could not, when the police brought her out into daylight, keep her eyes open. The light was physical pain to her. They were not people who had chosen to hide. They were people who had adapted over nearly a decade to a form of life that no one had ever adapted to before, and none of them could simply walk away from it. But they were, still, actively predatory. That is the other thing you have to understand. This is not a story where a passive family hid in a house and stole scraps. This is a story where a family, driven by circumstances that started with a false embezzlement charge in 1884, became something that had never, as far as I can find in any American criminal record, existed before. Between 1887 and 1893, 6 more tenants of Worthing House died in that building. Every single one of them was ruled a natural death by the Buffalo coroner. 4 of them were elderly. 2 of them were middle-aged men with known drinking problems. Every single one of them, at the time of their death, had valuables in their room that either went missing or were later found to be lighter than the deceased had claimed. Coins, pocket watches, cash from wallets. A gold ring from the finger of a widow named Ella Trusk, who died in room 2B in the summer of 1891. The method, as the police eventually reconstructed it, was not violent. It could not be violent, because a violent death would have brought investigators into the house. The Crandalls, over years of watching, had learned which tenants drank, which tenants took laudanum for their nerves, which tenants had weak hearts, and the hatches that opened from the hidden stairway into the guest rooms opened, in every case, next to the head of the bed. A hand, in the dark, holding a rag soaked in something. A pillow, pressed just long enough. A weak heart, given a small chemical push. Deaths that looked, to a coroner in 1891 who had 30 other cases that week, exactly like the natural deaths of vulnerable people in an old boarding house. And after each death, before the body was found in the morning, one of the Crandalls, almost certainly Cordelia because she was the smallest and could fit through the hatches most easily, would enter the room, take what could be taken quietly, and disappear back into the wall before dawn. Think for a moment about what that requires, not the killing, the waiting. Cordelia, who by 1891 was 20 years old and had lived in the walls for 6 years, had to sit at a hatch, in the dark, sometimes for hours, listening, waiting for the breathing on the other side of the wall to shift into the specific slow rhythm of deep sleep, waiting for the tenant to turn onto their back, waiting for the moment when a rag or a pillow could do its work without a struggle, and then, after, waiting again, for the last small sounds of the body to stop, for the room to become fully still, before opening the hatch and doing the taking. This was not the work of a single terrible night. This was, by then, a household routine, a profession of a kind that a young woman had grown into the way another young woman might have grown into needlework or the piano. The other Crandalls, in the surviving police interviews, described a division of labour. Silas, whose hearing on his good side was still functional, listened at the hatches on the ground floor where the front desk was, and warned the family when Beckwith moved through the house at unusual hours. Marguerite handled what the police called the accounts, which is a chilling phrase to see written in a policeman's neat 1,894 handwriting. She kept the wooden box in the attic where the stolen valuables were stored, and she was the one who decided, over the years, which items could be sold and which had to be kept because they were too identifiable. Ambrose was the one who left the house. That is a detail that surprises people, and I want to sit on it for a second. Ambrose Crandall, the son, did leave the walls. Not often, not for long. But he was, according to his own confession after his arrest, the one who took the small stolen coins and pieces of jewellery out through the coal chute on carefully spaced nights and pawned them in a series of small establishments across Buffalo, always using a different name, always in a different neighbourhood, always at the shops that asked the fewest questions. The money he brought back was the money the family used to buy the small quantities of dried food that supplemented what they stole from the kitchen. There was, in other words, an economy inside the walls of Worthing House. A functioning, if minimal, household economy run out of a hidden stairway funded by murder. Ambrose, when he confessed, said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first read it. He said that in the early years, when he first started making the trips out through the coal chute, he had thought about running, about simply not coming back, about walking to the train yards, jumping a freight car, and letting the rest of them believe he had been caught. He said he thought about it every time he went out for the first 2 years. And then, at some point, he stopped thinking about it. He said, in the recorded confession, "I don't know when I stopped. I only know that one night I noticed I hadn't thought of it in months, and I understood that I lived in the walls now. That was where I was from." That is what 9 years does to a person. The walls, by then, were not a place they were hiding. The walls were their country, and the tenants of Worthing House were, to the family, something between neighbours and livestock. That is not a comfortable way to describe human beings, but it is, I think, an honest description of what the Crandalls had become by the time Adelaide Voss checked into room 2C. Beckwith, the landlord, must have known something was wrong. 6 deaths in 6 years, in a house with only 12 rooms, is not a normal death rate. It is roughly 4 times higher than the mortality rate you would expect from a Buffalo boarding house in that period. He must have noticed. He almost certainly did notice. And the Buffalo police, in 1894, spent considerable effort trying to determine whether Beckwith had been in some kind of arrangement with whatever he thought was happening in his house. They never proved it, but the reason they never proved it is the reason we're about to get to. Because in the spring of 1894, something changed. Someone in the walls made a mistake, and the entire 9-year arrangement came apart in the space of 6 weeks. That mistake had a name, and the name was Adelaide Voss. Adelaide Voss checked into Worthing House on the 28th of March 1894. She was 29 years old. She was unmarried. She was travelling from Rochester to Cleveland to take a position as a private secretary for a lawyer who had advertised in the Rochester paper. Buffalo was her stopover. She had planned to stay 3 days. She was not a typical Worthing House tenant. She was educated. She had attended 2 years at a women's college. She was, by the standards of 1894, exceptionally observant, and she kept a journal. Portions of that journal survived, because after her death her sister came from Rochester to collect her belongings, and the journal went back to the family in a locked wooden box, and it stayed in that box until a great-niece donated it, in 1968, to the Buffalo Historical Society. The journal is why we know what happened in April of 1894 at Worthing House, in as much detail as we know it, because Adelaide Voss, unlike every other tenant of that building for the previous 9 years, did not accept the story that old houses just make old sounds. She wrote down what she heard. She wrote down when she heard it. She wrote down what she suspected, and she kept the journal, from the second night onward, hidden inside her mattress, where no hand reaching in from a wall could find it. Her first entry about the disturbance is dated the 1st of April, 1894. She writes, and I'm reading this directly from a transcription made in 1972, "Woke, at some hour past 2. There is a person in the wall behind my headboard. I do not mean a mouse. I do not mean the settling of wood. There is a person, breathing, and once I heard the person swallow. The sound of a human throat is not a sound one mistakes." She goes to Beckwith the next morning. Beckwith gives her the whiskey line. She writes, that evening, that she does not believe him and that she intends to test her theory. She takes a piece of dark thread from her sewing kit and she runs it across the seam of the wallpaper behind her bed, sealing it with a drop of candle wax at either end. If anyone opens that section of wall in the night, the thread will break. The next morning, April 3rd, the thread is broken. She writes, "Something was here in the night. I did not wake," which is worse than the alternative. Adelaide Voss does not leave. This is the detail that people, reading this journal today, cannot make sense of. She has proof, on April 3rd, that someone is entering her room from within the wall, and she does not pack her bags and leave that day. Instead, she sets a trap. She writes on April 5th that she has purchased a small dinner bell from a shop on Main Street, and she has rigged it with a wire attached to the section of wall she believes is the hatch. If the hatch opens, the bell will fall from a shelf above her bed and ring. She writes, "I know now that I am being watched, and possibly have been watched since I first crossed the threshold. I do not know by whom, or by how many. I do not know what they mean to do, but I will not leave without knowing. If I run now, I will spend the rest of my life wondering what was in the wall, and I would rather see it and die than not see it and live." Reading that line, in 1894, from a 29-year-old woman travelling alone to a job in Cleveland, is one of the most quietly astonishing things I have ever encountered in a piece of primary historical source material. She knew, and she chose to stay. The bell rings on the night of April 11th. Her journal entry from the morning of April 12th is the longest single entry in the surviving portion of the journal. She writes that the bell rang shortly after 3 in the morning, that when she lit her lamp, the section of wall she had marked was open by about 6 inches, that in the opening she saw a face. She writes, "The face was a woman's, or had been a woman's. She was very old, or her circumstances had made her very old. Her eyes did not blink. She did not seem afraid to have been seen. She looked at me for what I can only estimate was 3 or 4 seconds, and then the hatch closed. That was Marguerite Crandall, 52 years old, blind in one eye, seen for the first time in 9 years by a person who was not her own family." I want you to sit with that image for a second, because it is the image on which this entire story turns. A woman who had once, in 1881, been the schoolteacher wife of a bookkeeper in a townhouse on Ellicott Street. A woman who had, in her own quiet way, believed that if she pushed her family hard enough toward the city, they would rise into a life of small comforts and small dignities. That woman, 13 years later, at the age of 52, pressing her one working eye to a hatch in the wall of a room she did not rent, in a house she did not own, looking at a stranger who had figured out that she existed, and knowing, in that instant, that the arrangement her family had built over 9 winters and 9 summers had just ended, not because they had run out of money, not because they had run out of victims, because a 29-year-old woman from Rochester had refused to accept the story that old houses just make old sounds. Marguerite would have known, in the 3 or 4 seconds she stared at Adelaide, exactly what had to happen next. So would Adelaide. Adelaide Voss did not go to the police the next morning. She writes that she did not think the police would believe her, and she was almost certainly right. She writes that she intends to go instead to a newspaper, specifically to a reporter at the Buffalo Evening News named Coleman Frayne, whose byline she had noticed on a story about a workhouse scandal the previous year, and whom she believed might take her seriously. She never made it to Coleman Frayne. Her last journal entry is dated the evening of the 14th of April, 1894. She writes, "I leave in the morning. I have written to my sister. I have written a letter to Mr. Frayne which I will deliver by hand. Something has changed in the walls of this house. The breathing tonight is not the breathing of one person. It is the breathing of several, and it is not calm. I believe they know that I know. I do not think they will let me leave." Adelaide Voss was found dead in her bed on the morning of the 15th of April, 1894. The coroner ruled it a heart failure. She was 29 years old and in good health. The letter to Coleman Frayne was gone. The journal, hidden inside the mattress, was not. Here is where the story would have ended, in a boarding-house death in a forgotten American city, if Adelaide Voss had not also written to her sister. Her sister, Henrietta Voss, received the letter on April 17th. In the letter, Adelaide described, in less detail than she had in her journal, but in enough detail to matter, everything she had experienced at Worthing House: the breathing, the thread, the face in the hatch, and her intention to go to the reporter Coleman Frayne. Henrietta Voss received the letter on the same day that a telegram from the Buffalo police arrived at her home informing her that her sister was dead. Henrietta Voss was, according to every source that describes her, not a woman to be trifled with. She was a widow. She ran a millinery business in Rochester. She was 36 years old. She took the first train to Buffalo on the morning of April 18th, and she went directly, not to the police, but to the offices of the Buffalo Evening News, and she asked for Coleman Frayne, and she showed him the letter. Frayne was, apparently, exactly the reporter Adelaide had guessed him to be. He read the letter. He asked Henrietta Voss if he could keep it. He then went, that same afternoon, to the boarding house on Delaware Avenue, and asked Beckwith for permission to see the room where Adelaide Voss had died. Beckwith refused. Frayne wrote his first article about Worthing House on April 20th. It was short, and it was careful. He did not name the Crandalls, because he did not yet know their names or that they existed. He did not accuse Beckwith of anything specific. He simply described the death of a young woman in a boarding house on Delaware Avenue, noted that she had, in a letter to her sister, described hearing another person breathing inside the walls of her room in the days before her death, and asked whether the Buffalo police intended to investigate. The article ran on page 4 of the Evening News on the 21st of April, 1894. It was, in the ordinary course of things, the kind of item that would have been forgotten in a week. It was not forgotten. Over the following week, 3 separate former tenants of Worthing House came to the offices of the Evening News to tell Frayne, in confidence, that they had also heard things in the walls during their stays. 2 of them had heard breathing. One of them, a man named Prescott Halloran, who had lived in the house briefly in 1892, told Frayne that he had once, at night, seen his door handle turn very slowly, without the door opening, as if someone were testing it. He had left the next morning. Frayne wrote a second article. It ran on April 28th, and it named specific rooms. It cited the mortality rate at Worthing House and compared it, using numbers he had gotten from the City Health Office, with the rates at 3 other boarding houses of similar size on adjacent streets. Worthing House was, by his calculation, running a death rate roughly 4 times higher than any comparable establishment. The second article went to the front page. By May 1st, the story had been picked up by 2 other Buffalo papers and a Rochester paper. By May 5th, the Buffalo police, under public pressure that they had not felt in years, opened an official investigation. By May 10th, Beckwith was refusing to answer his door. By May 15th, a police detective named Alonzo Merritt had obtained a search warrant for Worthing House. The warrant was executed on the morning of the 19th of May, 1894. I want to pause here and describe, as best as I can from the surviving accounts, what the mood in Buffalo was in those 5 weeks between Adelaide Voss's death and the raid on Worthing House. Because it is easy, at this distance, to read the sequence of events and imagine that everything moved with a kind of inevitable momentum. It did not. It moved because a small number of specific people, in specific rooms, made specific choices that they were not required to make. Coleman Frayne could have accepted his editor's initial reluctance and dropped the story. He did not. Henrietta Voss could have gone home to Rochester and grieved privately. She did not. Detective Merritt, who was known in the department as a cautious man not given to public warrants against propertied Buffalo landlords, could have declined to sign the search order. He did not. Each of them, in their own moment, decided that what had happened to Adelaide Voss was not going to be another quiet death in another quiet boarding house. And there is a fourth person who does not appear in any of the newspaper accounts and who only shows up in one line of a subsequent police memorandum that I think about often. Her name was Ida Marchetti. She was the maid at Worthing House between 1892 and April of 1894. She was dismissed by Beckwith on April 18th, 3 days after Adelaide Voss died, on the grounds that she had been careless with the linens. Ida Marchetti went to Detective Merritt's precinct on April 22nd, the day after Coleman Frayne's first article ran, and she gave a statement that has not survived in full. What has survived is a single line, written in Merritt's own hand, in the margin of his working notes. The line reads, "The girl says she heard weeping in the pantry at night, and it was not the sound of a mouse." Ida Marchetti disappears from the record after that statement. She may have gone home to her family in Erie. She may have taken a train west. Or she may not have. Merritt's notes do not say. But her statement, together with the letter Henrietta Voss brought from Rochester, was almost certainly what pushed him to sign the warrant. Merritt entered the house at 7 in the morning with 4 uniformed officers and a locksmith. Beckwith opened the door in a state of undress and immediately began to protest. Merritt ignored him. The police went first to the cellar, on Frayne's recommendation, because Frayne had, over the previous weeks, done a considerable amount of research on the Krellman blueprints and had come to believe that whatever was happening in the house was originating from below. In the cellar, in the northeast corner, behind a stack of coal that had not been used in 10 years, they found the entrance to the hidden stairway. It took the officers, working with the locksmith, nearly 40 minutes to reach the top of the stairway, not because it was difficult to climb, but because at every level they had to stop and process what they were seeing. Small hollowed shelves cut into the interior of the wall, where dry crusts of bread and small dried strips of what turned out to be salted meat had been stored. Empty tin cans stacked in a corner, a chamber pot, a pile of rags that had been used, apparently, as bedding. Small horizontal viewing slats at every level of the house that opened directly into the guest rooms. And, on the second floor, next to the wall of room 2C, they found the small dinner bell that Adelaide Voss had rigged. Its wire had been carefully cut and tied off. The Crandalls, all 4 of them, were found in the attic. They had heard the officers coming. They had retreated to the highest point of the hidden stairway, which opened into a small unlit chamber under the eaves. Silas Crandall was holding a kitchen knife. When Detective Merritt reached the top and lifted his lantern, Silas did not attack. He simply lowered the knife, set it on the floor, and said, according to Merritt's report, one sentence. He said, "We didn't mean to become this." That sentence, when I first read it in Merritt's report, stopped me for a long time, because it is not the sentence of a monster. It is the sentence of a man who has been keeping accounts, in his head, for 9 years, and who has understood every day of those 9 years that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and who had, apparently, at some point stopped hoping that anyone would ever come and end it, and had begun, instead, quietly waiting for the moment when it would be over. The kitchen knife on the floor was not the knife of a man planning to fight. It was the knife of a man who had, for years, been prepared to use it on his own family before letting them be taken alive, and who was, in that last moment, choosing not to. Merritt, in his private notes to his superior, wrote that in his 15 years on the Buffalo force he had never made an arrest that felt less like an arrest and more like the closing of a very long door. The 4 Crandalls were taken out of Worthing House through the front entrance, one at a time, in daylight, in front of a small crowd of neighbours and reporters that had been gathering on Delaware Avenue for the previous hour. Coleman Frayne was there. He described, in the article that ran the next morning, the way Cordelia had to be carried out by 2 officers because she could not walk in the sunlight. He described the way Marguerite kept her one working eye covered with a rag. He described the way Silas, when he was placed in the police wagon, turned his face toward the wall of the house one last time, as if he were saying goodbye to a country he had lived in and was never going to see again. And he described the way Ambrose, when he was loaded into the wagon last, did not look at the house at all. He looked at the street, at the shop signs, at the horses, at the sky, as if he had already, in his mind, left the walls years before, and was only now being permitted to admit it out loud. The Crandalls, when they were brought out of Worthing House on the morning of the 19th of May 1894, were a public sensation for approximately 6 days. The Buffalo papers ran their names, their photographs, their reconstructed history. The Rochester and New York City papers picked up the story. For a brief moment, the Crandall family, the family that had lived in the walls of a boarding house for 9 years and killed at least 7 people from inside them, was one of the most talked about criminal cases in the eastern United States. And then, almost overnight, the coverage stopped. This is the part of the story that people who study Fear Tartaria, and I want to be honest here that Fear Tartaria is a framework and not a proven historical thesis, find suggestive. Because what happened to the coverage of the Crandall case in the second week of June 1894 was not a natural news cycle running its course. It was a coordinated silence. Coleman Frayne wrote a third article, planned for publication on the 8th of June 1894, that reportedly went into greater detail about the Krellman blueprints, the age of Worthing House, and the possibility that the hidden stairway was not unique to that building. The article was pulled by the editor of the Evening News the night before it was scheduled to run. Frayne resigned from the paper 8 days later. He took a position with a small paper in Toledo, and he never wrote about the Crandall case again. The Krellman blueprints, which had been on file in the Buffalo City Records office since 1871, were reported missing from that office in an internal audit in December of 1894. Someone had checked them out. No signature was recorded. They were never returned. Worthing House itself was demolished on the 3rd of July 1894, less than 7 weeks after the police raid. The demolition was ordered by the city, not by Beckwith, and the stated justification was public health. Beckwith was compensated at a rate that several Buffalo real estate agents at the time described, in private correspondence that survives, as unusually generous. Beckwith left Buffalo before the end of the year and moved to Cincinnati, where he lived uneventfully until his death in 1908. The Crandalls themselves. Silas Crandall died in the Buffalo County Jail on the 18th of July 1894 of what the jail physician recorded as pneumonia. He was 53 years old. Marguerite Crandall was declared insane by a court-appointed physician and committed to the Buffalo State Asylum on the 2nd of August 1894. She died there in 1897. Ambrose Crandall stood trial for the murders of 6 people in October of 1894 and was convicted. He was executed by hanging on the 11th of March 1895. Cordelia Crandall is where the story becomes strange again. Cordelia was 22 years old at the time of her arrest. She had lived in the walls since she was 13. She had never, in any meaningful sense, had a life as an adult outside those walls. The court determined that she could not be held fully responsible for her actions, given the conditions of her upbringing after 1885. She was not tried. She was committed, like her mother, to the Buffalo State Asylum. And then, in December of 1894, according to a single line in the intake register of a private hospital in Rochester, a young woman matching Cordelia Crandall's description was transferred there for specialized care. The Buffalo State Asylum has no record of the transfer. The Rochester Hospital has no record of what became of the patient after her admission. There is no death certificate, no burial record, no further mention of Cordelia Crandall anywhere in any surviving American record. Someone paid for her transfer, someone paid for her care, and someone made sure that whatever happened to her after that transfer, no one, then or later, was going to be able to trace it. The Buffalo Historical Society, in a folder that was catalogued only in the 1970s, holds a single letter that may or may not be relevant. It is dated February 1895, roughly 2 months after Cordelia's transfer. It is addressed to a man whose name has been partially blacked out in ink at an address in New York City that no longer exists. It is unsigned. And it reads, in its entirety, "The Buffalo matter is concluded. The remaining subject is under private supervision and will remain so. Recommend no further correspondence on this. That letter is not proof of anything. It could refer to a business dispute. It could refer to any of a dozen other Buffalo scandals from that year. But the phrase, the remaining subject, is not the phrase you use in 1895 to describe a business rival or a wayward employee. It is the phrase you use when you are talking about a person the way a person is talked about in a police file, or in a hospital chart, or in the private correspondence of people who are used to making other people disappear. There is one more thing that has to be said about the aftermath, and it is the thing that, when I first read it, made me understand that the Crandall case was not a self-contained event. Ambrose Crandall, in the 8 days between his conviction and his execution in March of 1895, was interviewed one final time by a prison chaplain named Reverend Josiah Merrick. Merrick's notes from that interview survived in the archives of the Methodist Episcopal Church in western New York and were transcribed and published in an obscure denominational journal in 1938. In that interview, Ambrose was asked whether he wished to make any final statement of confession beyond what he had already given at trial. He said yes, and what he said, according to Merrick's notes, was this. He said that the family had not been the first to live in the walls of Worthing House. He said that in their first weeks inside the hidden stairway, in the spring of 1886, they had found evidence, in the small chamber at the top, of prior occupancy. Bones, is what he said. Small bones, and rags, and a leather shoe. Old, but not ancient. Ambrose said his father had cleared them out and never spoke of them again, and that the family had agreed, in a way that never had to be discussed, that they would not think about who had been there before them, or how they had ended up as small bones in the attic of a Buffalo boarding house. Merrick, in his notes, records that he asked Ambrose whether he had told the police any of this. Ambrose said no. He said he had not told the police because he had understood from the moment of his arrest that there were things about Worthing House that the people who ran Buffalo did not want said out loud. And he had known, from the moment they took his father out of the attic in handcuffs, that his family had been living inside a house that had already, before them, eaten someone else. Sit with that for a moment. Because if Ambrose was telling the truth to Reverend Merrick in the last week of his life, and there is no obvious reason he would have lied to a chaplain 8 days before his own execution, then the Crandall family was not the beginning of what happened in the walls of Worthing House. They were the middle. Someone, or several someones, had lived in that hidden stairway before them. Someone had died in the small chamber at the top under the eaves. Their bones and a leather shoe had been sitting there, waiting, when a starving Buffalo bookkeeper and his wife and their 2 children climbed in through the coal chute in the spring of 1886. And that someone, whoever they were, had never appeared in a Buffalo newspaper, never appeared in a missing persons report, never appeared in a police file. They were, in the most complete sense of the word, gone. Which means that the pattern of forgetting that closed around the Crandalls in June of 1894 was not the first time that pattern had closed around Worthing House. It was, at minimum, the second time, and it may not have been the last. Reverend Merrick did not, according to his notes, ask Ambrose the follow-up question that any reader of this transcript wants to ask. He did not ask how old the bones had looked. He did not ask whether they had been a child or an adult. He did not ask whether the family had ever, in 9 years, wondered about the person or persons those bones had once been. Merrick was a minister, not an investigator, and he was interviewing a man who was going to be hanged in 8 days for 6 murders. He was there for confession, not for forensics. But the omission, when you read the transcript today, is the loudest silence in the entire archive of the Crandall case. Because everything else in this story, however terrible, at least has a name attached to it. The bones in the attic do not. The people who study fear Tartaria will tell you that this pattern, the sudden silencing of a story, the disappearance of blueprints, the demolition of a building, the loss of a witness into a private institution, is the exact pattern you should look for when the world you thought you were living in turns out to have been built on top of something that no one wants you to see. Whether you believe that framework or not, the questions that the Crandall case raises are questions that were not answered in 1894 and have not been answered since. Question 1. Crellman, the Prussian architect who designed Worthing House in 1871, designed at least 4 other buildings in Buffalo during his career. 2 of them survived into the 20th century. One was a private residence on Franklin Street that was demolished in 1912. The other was a hotel on Niagara Street that stood until 1934. The Franklin Street residence was described, in a real estate listing from 1908, as having unusual interior wall dimensions. The Niagara Street Hotel, when it was finally torn down, was reported by the demolition crew to have contained, on one interior wall, a sealed doorway that opened into a narrow vertical space of no apparent purpose. Neither building was ever searched, neither was ever investigated. The reports from the demolition crews survive only as marginal notes in the private papers of the contractors. Question 2. How did Beckwith not know? For 9 years, a family of 4 lived inside the walls of a house that Beckwith owned and operated. The Buffalo police, in 1894, believed he did not know, and they never charged him with anything. But 6 deaths in 6 years, in a 12-room house, is not something a landlord fails to notice. The most charitable interpretation is that Beckwith knew something was wrong, could not identify what it was, and chose not to look too hard. The less charitable interpretation is the one that Coleman Frayne was reportedly investigating in the article that was killed. Question 3. Who paid to transfer Cordelia Crandall to Rochester? The Buffalo State Asylum was a state institution. Transfers to private hospitals had to be authorized, and someone had to pay for them. There is no record, in any surviving Buffalo County or New York State archive, of who ordered or funded that transfer. And once she was transferred, she vanishes from every record we have. This does not happen, in 1894, to an ordinary criminal defendant. Somebody wanted Cordelia Crandall to disappear, and had the resources to make it happen. Question 4. And this is the one that, honestly, I find hardest to think about. The Buffalo Police report on the Crandall arrests, which survives in fragmentary form in the Buffalo Historical Society's holdings, includes a description of the Crandalls' living space at the top of the hidden stairway. It describes the rags used as bedding. It describes the tin cans. It describes the pile of stolen valuables in a small wooden box in the corner. And it describes, in one sentence, a stack of paper documents, apparently in Silas Crandall's hand, comprising notes on the tenants of the boarding house over a period of approximately 8 years. Silas Crandall had been keeping a ledger, 9 years of observation from inside the walls of every person who checked in and checked out of Worthing House. Notes on their habits, notes on their drinking, notes on their health, notes on their valuables. A parallel ledger kept in the walls that mirrored and shadowed the ledger Beckwith kept at the front desk. Those documents are not in the Buffalo Historical Society. They are not in the Buffalo Police Archives. They are not in the New York State Archives. They are not, as far as any researcher has ever been able to determine, anywhere. They were logged into evidence on the 19th of May, 1894. They are not present in the evidence catalogue for the Ambrose Crandall trial in October of 1894. Somewhere in that 5-month window, they disappeared. Whoever pulled Coleman Frayne's article, whoever ordered the demolition of Worthing House, whoever transferred Cordelia Crandall to Rochester, whoever pulled the Crellman blueprints from the city records office, that same person, or that same group of people, made sure that Silas Crandall's 9-year ledger of a Buffalo boarding house never made it to a courtroom, a newspaper, or a historian. And that is the question that, for me, this story finally lands on. Not what the Crandalls did, not how they lived, not how they killed. Those things are documented, and they are terrible, and they are, in their way, a matter of record. The question is, who else, in Buffalo in 1894, had a reason to want that ledger to disappear? Because if you were a person of standing in Buffalo in the 1880s and early 1890s, and you had stayed a night at a boarding house on Delaware Avenue where the landlord did not ask too many questions, and you had done something in that room that you would not have wanted your wife, your business partners, or your church to know about, and the walls of that room had been listening the whole time, and someone in those walls had been writing down what they heard, you would have wanted that ledger to disappear too. I want to close by putting the Crandall story in the context that I think it belongs in. And I want to be clear that this is the point in the video where I am moving from what is documented to what is inference. You can accept it or reject it. I only ask that you consider it. The 19th century in the United States, especially in the eastern cities, was a period when a very large number of buildings were constructed with interior spaces that had no obvious purpose. Hidden staircases, sealed rooms, passages inside walls, cavities beneath floors. Some of these have straightforward explanations. Servants' passages to keep the domestic staff invisible to the family. Smugglers' routes in coastal cities for goods that had not been declared to customs. Priest holes and safe rooms in houses built by families with reason to fear a political enemy. But some of them, and this is the point, do not have straightforward explanations. There are buildings from the 1860s, 70s, and 80s all over the Northeast that were built with hidden interior spaces that no one in the 20th century was ever able to explain. Worthing House was one. The Franklin Street residence in Buffalo was another. The Niagara Street Hotel was a third. And if you look at the architectural records of Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, and Chicago from that period, you will find dozens of others. The people who study Fear Tartaria take this pattern and argue that it points to a specific historical moment in the middle of the 19th century when the built environment of the United States was constructed by, or on top of the ruins of, a civilization that we have collectively been trained not to see. They argue that the hidden spaces in these buildings were not designed for the purposes we assume. They argue that some of them were designed for surveillance. Some of them were designed for concealment. And some of them, and this is the darkest version of the argument, were designed for something that was never spoken aloud. I am not going to tell you whether that framework is right. I do not know. What I will tell you is that the Crandall case, on its own terms, does one specific thing that is very hard to explain away. It documents, in a way that a court of law accepted, the existence of a hidden interior stairway in an American city building of that era that no one alive in 1894 could explain, that the original architect had built without ever leaving a written justification for it, and that a family of 4 lived inside for 9 years. That happened. It is in the record. And the effort that was made, in the weeks and months after the Crandalls were discovered, to make sure that no one ever looked too closely at how it was possible for it to have happened, is also in the record. You are welcome to draw whatever conclusion from that you want to draw. But I would ask you, the next time you are in a very old house, especially one built between about 1860 and 1890, to notice how thick the interior walls are, to notice whether there are dead spaces on the blueprints, to notice whether the floor plan on one level lines up with the floor plan on the level above it, and to notice, when you turn out the light and lie down in the dark, whether the sound of the house at night is the sound of settling wood, or the sound of something else. The story of the Crandall family of Buffalo, New York, is not a ghost story. It is a documented event, in a documented location, with named victims and named perpetrators, and a paper trail that survives, in fragments, in 3 separate archives. It is, in the specific sense that matters, real. And it happened in 1894, in the United States, in a city that is still on the map, on a street you can still drive down. Worthing House is gone. The lot where it stood is now, according to current Buffalo City records, occupied by a small parking structure for a chain pharmacy. There is no plaque, there is no marker. Almost no one who parks their car there has ever heard the name Crandall, or the name Voss, or the name Krellman. That is the part that stays with me. Not the walls, and not the killings, and not the hidden stairway, the forgetting. The way an entire event of this weight can be lifted, deliberately and carefully, out of the public memory of a city, until the only trace of it is a journal in a historical society, a police report in a fragmentary folder, and a great-niece in 1968 opening a wooden box she inherited from her grandmother. And the thing about the forgetting is that it worked. It worked for over 130 years. It works so well that if you walk into the Buffalo Central Library today and ask a librarian for information on the Crandall case of 1894, you will be looked at, in most cases, with genuine confusion. It is not that the story has been suppressed in the sense of being sealed in a vault. It has been suppressed in the far more effective sense of being made uninteresting, of being reduced to a footnote in a footnote, of being classified, in whatever silent hierarchy decides these things, as one of those small 19th century murder cases that does not really rise to the level of the true crime that gets remembered. And I would ask you to consider, for one moment before you close this video, how many other stories of that same weight, from the same decades, in the same American cities, have been reduced in the same way to the same kind of silence. Because if the answer is one, then Buffalo in 1894 is an anomaly, and if the answer is more than one, then it is not. If this is the first time you've heard the Crandall story, I would guess it is. And if you found what you just heard worth an hour of your evening, the best thing you can do is subscribe, because next week I'm going into a case that runs in the exact same pattern in a different American city, in the same decade, and by the end of that video I think the pattern will not feel like a coincidence anymore. Click the video on your screen now. It's the one you should watch next. Because that is the thing about houses that were built in the 1870s and the 1880s in this country. Someone built them, and someone lived in them, and in some of them, someone lived inside them, in the spaces between the rooms, in the dark places behind the plaster, and left, when they were finally taken out, a story that the rest of the world was very carefully not supposed to hear. The Crandalls are one of those stories. There are others. I'll see you in the walls.